Welcome, everyone. I expect that we will have more people joining still over the next few minutes, but let us get started. Welcome to this another version of the Econics webinar series. This time we focus on updating these scenarios and keeping the SSPs up to date. And similar as last time, we have some of the settings actually in the webinar here restricted. So when we come to the Q&A part, you can raise your hands, and then actually you can, at that point, you can unmute yourself and start your video so that you can actually ask your question. Or you can ask your questions in the chat if you want that. I want to also stress that we, as usual, post a recording afterwards on YouTube. And so if you don't want to be visible in that way, keep your camera off and or your microphone if you don't want your voice there either. And then ask your question in the chat. We have a nice lineup of speakers for you today. We unfortunately, Keiwan Riai had to excuse himself because of some other urgent issues, but Detlef van Vuuren from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency will kick us off and present some considerations on keeping the scenarios up to date. And after some Q&A on that topic, we will move to Samir KC and Wolfgang Lutz, both from IIASA, who will present the considerations on population updates. And after some discussion on that, we will move to Rob Dellink and Marian Leimbach. Rob Dellink from the OECD, Marian Leimbach from Potsdam Institute on Climate Impacts Research, who will present updates on economic projections, or the plans for updates on economic projections. And then we will have time for some final discussion. So yeah, without further ado, let me give the floor to Detlef to kick us off on considerations for keeping the scenarios up to date. And you're muted, Detlef.
Yes, I hope I'm sharing the presentation. I think not, huh?
You are. Yes.
Okay. Strange. I can't see it. Okay. Yes. Oh, thank you. And yeah, welcome everybody as well. Also on behalf of Keiwan. Yeah. So my role is first of all to start giving a little overview of why we would potentially like to update the SSPs. And for that, it might first of all be useful to think why we have community scenarios in the first place. And the RCPs and SSPs as a combination were meant to support environmental assessment as a community scenario. And why is it attractive? Yeah, so first of all, to have consistency of research. If we are looking into different futures and people are publishing different papers, maybe somebody specifically on water scarcity and somebody else on climate change, it is helpful to some degree if we can understand a bit what people have researched. And if we have somehow a common language about, oh, I looked into an SSP2 or an SSP5 type of scenario, that really helps to easily understand each other's results. That's even more true if we were looking into similar topics, like climate change. It would help if papers are easily comparable. Secondly, there's the reasons of efficiency. If I'm looking into possible energy scenarios, and I really wouldn't like to myself develop population or economic growth scenarios, it really helps if standard scenarios are available for me to use. Now, finally, it's really helpful for assessments. If the IPCC or IPBES or the Global Land Outlook at some point needs to summarize what's in the literature, it obviously really helps if that literature is already to some degree organized. It doesn't mean that everybody has to use these scenarios. It's actually useful if there is diversity as well. But in certain applications, it helps if we are using community scenarios. Now, to take the timeline of the SSP RCP development, So activities really started around 2007, when an IPCC expert meeting indicated that new scenarios were needed. In response, the integrated assessment community started to organize itself. It actually created the IMC in response to this IPCC call and first developed RCP scenarios. They were supposed to be relatively quickly. They should be existing scenarios from the literature and then worked around and to be able to use in climate research. It actually took us much more time than we originally thought. But in 2011, the RCPs were published. And it's basically a range of emission pathways spanning a range from well below 2 to 5 degrees. After that, we immediately started to think of having a second set of scenarios, which would look much more into real socioeconomic pathways. This was based on a paper that was published in 2010, the Moss et al. Paper, where we indicated that we wanted to have this parallel track. So first of all, provide information for climate modelers to work with, the RCPs, and then to have the time available to start developing more comprehensive economic scenarios, and later integrated that again. A very, very important step here was actually the workshop in Denver in 2012, organized mostly by Brian O'Neill, and I saw he was already on the participant list, where we, with a group of around 60 people, made the first storylines of the SSPs. And that was elaborated further in small groups and that finally published in 2014. At the same time, we had been working also on the quantification of the main drivers. And so at that time also population scenarios and economic scenarios by the OECD and IIASA modeling teams were published. And this was done in a nice exercise where actually these teams collaborated. Information on education, for instance, was exchanged. And we had also several rounds of review. Then that information was forwarded to the integrated assessment modeling teams, 6 individual teams, which published possible consequences for energy, land, and emissions in 2017. That was subsequently picked up by CMIP, and in 2011 and 2012, this information is now used in the IPCC. But that does mean that basically when we started the quantification around 2013 and had them published in 2014, and that we are by now, about 10 years later, are using information from 10 years ago on our expected developments for population and economic growth. I'll come back to that in a second, but maybe it's useful to have a quick look again. For some of you, this will be really well known, but maybe for some others, it's still useful on what is this SSP RCP framework. So we designed it specifically with in mind the use of this framework by climate research. And therefore, we wanted this framework to have at least 2 axes that were relevant if you look at climate research as a whole, which is, first of all, the level of climate change, and secondly, the socioeconomic development. And for socioeconomic development, we wanted to work out 2 characteristics. These scenarios were going to be used to support climate policy, and therefore they should speak to the 2 main forms of climate policy, which are mitigation and adaptation. And so in terms of socioeconomic development, we wanted to depict futures where it would be easy to mitigate, easy to adapt, but also difficult to mitigate and difficult to adapt in all possible combinations. You could also say, if you want to make it a bit more generic and have these scenarios also be useful for other forms of environmental assessment, that this could be about proactive environmental policy and reactive environmental policy, and that the level of climate change might be also not only about climate change, but also about environmental pressure in general. Yeah, that framework was then elaborated in different matrices. One of them is this matrix where we plot the SSPs against the different socioeconomic developments against the RCPs. And then we had 5 different SSPs based on these combinations of easy to adapt, easy to mitigate, difficult to adapt, difficult to mitigate. This was elaborated into 5 storylines that are actually even more important than these original definitions. And that creates a matrix of possibilities. This matrix is shown here is from a paper published in 2020 by O'Neill et al., where people try to evaluate what was done in the last few years with this SSP framework. And the colors actually indicate how often a specific SSP-RCP combination has been used. And it's already interesting to see, quickly have a look at this graph, because the black colors indicate that the specific SSP-RCP combination has been used a lot. And you can see that some of the very low SSP-RCP combinations have been used. I think by now, if you do it, this is done early 2020, maybe 2019. If you would do it now, probably you would see somewhat darker colors also at the 1.9 watts per square meter level, the 1.5 degree warming. But at the time, you can see that there's also quite a bias to the very high levels. And so people have been using RCP 8.5 quite a lot, which is interesting because there's also this publication by Hausvater and Peters pointing out how unlikely RCP 8.5 has become by now. We can, I think, conclude that the SSP's RCP framework has been extremely successful. The paper by O'Neill et al. Evaluates it. At that time, it found that more than 1,300 applications of the SSPs. I think that has been exploded again in the last 2 years, simply by the CMIP6 scenario MIP use of the SSPs. So it must be even in the thousands by now, I guess. But they were also used very much by other target audiences than originally the climate audience. It has been used in IPBES. It has been used in the Global Land Outlook, in the nitrogen assessments. And so it found a very nice way to connect different research communities. It has also been used in local assessments. This is a paper by Pedersen et al., where different scenarios were evaluated in terms of their actual comparison to what happened in reality. And so it's a bit of a complicated graph. I will explain it. And so the dark line is actually indicating the development of CO2 emissions over time. And that goes until 2020. After it, it's followed by a projection, which is average to the historical development. Then these bars are different scenarios, and they are indicating the moment that the scenarios were published, and then the projections. Let's, for instance, take SRES. SRES was published in 2000. The last year that it was the last year of data that was available was 1995. And then there is a bar that is actually indicating the first projection year of SRES. That was 2010. And then the 2020 values, 2030 values. And what is actually shown is that reality somehow more or less tracked the middle of the SRES scenarios. And that was not really necessary. Scenarios don't have a real probabilistic interpretation. They could have been just as useful if reality turned out to be at the highest or the lowest scenario. But interestingly, it tracked pretty much the middle of the SRES set up to 2020. And if history would continue in the current rate, also in 2030. You can do the same for the SSPs. And so the SSPs were more or less, the last year of data from the SSPs was 2005, the base year data. Then we have the first projection years, and we have the values for 2020, for 2030. And again, you could start comparing, and you could see again that in principle for CO2 emissions, again, more or less, CO2 is following the middle of the range. It's slowing down the actual emission growth in the last few years, and therefore it's getting closer to the low end of the range. But yeah, the set as a whole also includes mitigation scenarios. So by 2030, the full range of SRS is still quite representative. SSPs is quite representative. You can do the same for population, GDP, and then at the global level, actually, we're not really doing badly compared to history. We're a bit high on population, a bit high on GDP, reasonably on energy, but in the presentations given in a few minutes or later in this webinar on population and GDP, you will see that that conclusion is not so true if you look into much more into details at different regions. And you could also critique not on basis on historical performance, but on your expected developments. For instance, and this is this paper that I mentioned before by Hausvater, and they, despite the SSPs doing reasonably well in the historical period, say that with expected development, the SSPs might be way too high, especially SSP 5. Coming back to that paper by O'Neill et al. O'Neill et al. Looked back and on the basis of that had a few thoughts about future scenarios. And they indicated a number of priorities. We should improve the integration of societal and climate conditions in future releases of scenarios. We should be improving the applicability to regional and local scales, and not only large region data, but maybe also look much more into the detail. We should produce a broader range of reference scenarios, include climate impacts potentially in these reference scenarios, start to include more explicitly climate policy, because climate policy is now among us. We should capture relevant perspectives and uncertainties better in the scenarios. We should keep scenarios up to date, improve the relevance for climate change scenarios for the users, so maybe more directly used with different scenarios. And there were also an outlook session. Now, I would like to take that point of keep scenarios up to date. And then what O'Neill et al. Said is, it's very clear that it's important to keep scenarios up to date with scenario development. And for instance, we see that economic development in many regions would be different from the projections. We have to COVID-19, and so we know that this is really important. However, O'Neill et al. Also say there is an inherent tension between the revisions and providing a stable set for scenario information for consistency. So you can't just change the scenarios all the time if the cycle of scenario analysis in the IPCC, for instance, is about 5 to 7 years. And so somehow you need to find an optimal point here. And also, we need a clear process for updates at SSPs with quantification. And so here too, as you saw earlier, it takes time to do this. This should also be taken into account. So the O'Neill et al. Paper continues by saying, yeah, maybe you have to have regular updates for quantitative drivers and IAM scenarios, and that should be maybe 5 years. Maybe it should be quicker, like the World Energy Outlook provides every single year an update. But as I indicated, there might also be very important reasons not to do so. At the same time, they argue that the narratives in the framework should be more stable, and we should not be updating the RCPs quicker than the CMIP and IPCC cycles. Then on my very last slides, I'm considering, based on this, 4 levels of ambition with regard to updates. And so one is, maybe it's important to note that history is sometimes different from what we have done, that we have projected in the scenarios. And just making sure that the scenarios go through the history makes the scenarios more relevant. If you already start wrongly at 2020 at the moment, if you miss the COVID crisis, that is not helpful, because for the credibility of the scenario, for the short-term performance. And so maybe you could change the base year and then scale the whole scenario with the base year. Secondly, you could update the projections. That's already a level of ambition higher. If we have now new information of the future based on what happened historically, maybe we should simply run the same models or slightly improved models and then make new projections. The next level of ambition is saying, okay, these scenarios were based on a narrative. And maybe those narratives are not so relevant anymore. And the SSP1 narrative, which is a mild emphasis on sustainable development, is that still relevant? Or is it by now, has the world changed? Do you want to emphasize a stronger sustainable development, degrowth? Do you want to include more explicitly the role of digitalization? And you can also think of replacing the total framework. It was designed for a certain goal. And maybe at some point, that goal is not important anymore. Now, in our view, these levels of ambition are also related to levels of how often you want to do this. Maybe the base year update you want to do every single year or every few years. Individual teams have been doing this. And my own team, for instance, does this every 2 years or so. Then the update of the projections, maybe that's the 5-year period. The update of the narratives, maybe we have to discuss how often we want to do that, and to replace the total framework the same. What we wanted to do in this process is, yeah, I'm finishing up.
Okay.
In this process is update mostly the projections, and that's what the discussion is about today. We also want to have a discussion about the 3rd and 4th level later in time, and that is what we are now envisioning. And so the Iconix webinar would be to present the plan to the community. That's now. Then at the IMC meeting, we want to discuss the main inputs of assumptions, and that's on this 2nd level, the improving, updating the ambition of the current projections. Then until May, we hope that population groups and economic groups might want to make new scenarios and make them available, so that at the forum next year, scenarios forum, we could present these initial quantifications and finalize and publish them summer 2022. At that same forum, we might want to start some discussions about more fundamental updates. And I'm not sure what comes out of that. Maybe we even decide that they are still fine. But then we would already have the updated current scenarios, the new projections, and we could have at the same time that more fundamental discussion. Yeah, so this is also the agenda. We have now a Q&A session. After that, discuss ideas for population and projections with another Q&A session, and discuss ideas for GDP, the GDP projections, and another Q&A session. So I would like to open up now, and we still have about 10 minutes left for this Q&A.
So if you have questions, point on this, please raise your hand so that you can be unmuted and ask them. Brian?
Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
So can I go ahead?
You're Gaurav?
Oh, Gaurav? Yeah, okay.
So
Sure.
my question is that mention about like 5 years. So don't you think 5 years is too much? Because nowadays the kind of changes happening, what we have seen, it's like it should be at least like 1 year or something, because the changes happening are like very fast. So 5 years would be like too much if we are actually aiming some mitigation in country specific or regional area. Because 5 years, what I think from like, if I see from Indian perspective or Asian perspective, it is like too much of time. Like I just need an opinion from your side about it.
I think that's a very good question. And so let's first of all conclude that now the current scenarios that are at least 8 years old are really over. The update is overdue, and that needs to happen anyway. So let's do that. Then secondly, let's also discuss in the community how often we want to update scenarios. And I can see your standard point of view that you need to do this often because they need to be relevant. At the same time, these are community scenarios. And there's also a reason to be not updating too fast, because then if you would update them every year, at some point that advantage of having similar projections across the scenarios is not useful anymore, because they are always updated. Are you talking about the SSP 1 version of 2011 or 2012 or 2013? And so there is an amount, there's a speed that we can, as a community, can accommodate. That doesn't mean that individual teams can update more often, or that maybe there could also be a way that we have one scenario that is in the middle and that's updated more frequently. So there are ways that we could handle this, but let's discuss that with the community, how fast we want to do that, for instance, at the scenario forum. But first of all, focus on that immediate update that is necessary now, because 8 years is way too long. Brian.
Okay, Brian.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, boss, for the help unmuting myself. That was my biggest challenge. Detlef, I was wondering if you could say something. I know there's been some thinking about this, but on how should we think about the consistency with the CMIP projections, which have already been done, once we go updating the SSPs, which would imply that the emissions projections would be a bit different. And so should we consider that an issue, or how should we think about it?
Yeah, so we have the advantage in principle that climate models are not as sensitive to some of the parameters in the short term that are really, really important, for instance, for climate policy analysis. And so earlier with the with the SSPs replacing the RCPs, we also try to design them in a way that we could keep consistency with the long-term climate projections, and at the same time allow ourselves for more socioeconomic parameters to add different numbers that would be interesting for environmental assessment or policy assessment. And so maybe that is the same story here. Maybe here too, again, it might be useful if so we do now first this update of the population and GDP stuff, and which is maybe not directly interfering too much with CMIP numbers. But if we would continue and also have an IAM update, see how we can ideally preserve consistency with the CMIP scenarios, so that impact researchers also in 2024 have something where they can use updated scenarios from our side and still combine them with CMIP 6 outcomes.
Okay, I see we have a question from Edo Schets.
Hi, yes, thank you, Detlef, for the presentation. That was really useful. I'm coming at this as a relative outsider. I work at the Bank of England, and we use climate scenarios for financial stability analysis. But one question that I have when I look at this framework is, well, the RCP scenarios, or the RCP component of the scenarios, revolves around a single variable, namely radiative forcing, whereas the SSP component actually comprises a series of variables. And I suppose there may be a point at which, trying to bulk too many variables in an SSP makes it more difficult to kind of track which variables drive the outcomes of a certain SSP narrative. So I just as a consideration, I wonder if it could be useful to actually split the SSPs up into several components where a user could choose, to have a certain assumption on population growth and another assumption on maybe economic development or adaptation efforts, etc.
Yeah, thanks. A few considerations. So first of all, unfortunately, the world is quite complex, and so it's not as easy to define two simple axes and then have all possible futures. So in reality, when you indicated that the climate is one single axis, yeah, they are characterized along one single radiative forcing axis. But in reality, there is already different emissions of different gases along that axis, and so air pollution is moving a bit along that axis, and land use. And so there are multiple variables also at play along the forcing axis, and that's also true for the socioeconomic axis. I'm not entirely sure how much we would like that mixing and matching that you were mentioning, because the disadvantage is that we also believe that there is some consistency among those parameters. And so it is likely, if you're in a high economic growth world, that education might be high in that particular world, and as a result, the demographic transition is also relatively fast. And I realize that that is not cut in stone exactly, and that there might be reasons why you sometimes want to do that slightly different. But there was also a very good reason why we wanted those to be combined. So again, maybe at the scenario forum, in that discussion on design of future exercises, this might also be a point that we would like to look into. But I can see still the advantage of using storylines as a principle of making sure that there is consistency among the different elements in a story.
I see there's 2 questions coming in the chat now. Maybe we can do them really briefly.
I got Giacomo's now first.
Yeah.
Should we extend variables? Yes, and that we have been discussing that. So actually there are a few. So since the SSPs have been published, several people have published other parameters related to the SSPs, among them income distribution. And so we were thinking that it might be good to identify scenarios where parameters where we believe that there's enough robustness behind them that they can nicely be coupled to the storyline. And secondly, they are used by many, and to also make them available within the set. And we might not be able to do that in June next year already, but actually income distribution was among them. That was one that we would like to be added. Yeah, and I also agree with the point made by Adriaan Perels that if we would more frequently update, then it's really important that somehow there's a tracking system and a versioning system that is very, very clear. And personally, as I indicated, I hope that we can update much more often than we have done so far. And at the same time, this should be done in a way that is still not too fast for a community to be able to track. Okay, at this point of time, I think we move to the demographic discussion, and if there are still questions that are in there, let's come back to them later in the webinar. So I would like to go to the demographics part of this webinar. At this point in time, I would like also to hand over to Samir. Both Wolfgang and Samir were involved in the original development of the demographic scenarios of the SSPs. At that time, already working together with the OECD, first on stories of education, and then translating those into demographic projections and economic projections. So the floor is yours, Samir.
Thank you, Detlef. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, perfect.
I share my screen. Okay, thank you, Detlef, for this nice presentation. It was also a good overview for me. So I, with Wolfgang and our Wittgenstein Center team in and around Vienna, we have been working on developing the population projection model since a long time. And for the SSPs, we developed this projection model by age, gender, and education attainment in 2012. And I think the current version that is used at the IIASA repository is, I think, January 2013 version. So after that, we have been updating the inputs because, as Gaurav was saying and others, that some of the, for the population distributions, we need to wait for 10 years because census is the time when we get the real population distribution that we will know for real. But other like the components of change, the fertility, mortality, and migration, and the education transitions, they come periodically, sometimes every 5 years. Some demographic and health surveys provide this fertility information every 5 years. But for some information, we have to wait for the 10 years for the next census. So when someone asks me to do the update every year, then that would be very challenging. But yeah, just to answer that, Gaurav's question. And I have been working on India a lot, yeah. So just to have these 3 steps that we took to prepare to develop the SSP population projections. So yeah, we call it the WIC, which is short for Wittgenstein Center. That it's called 2013-14. That is the current kind of a version that is out there used by the community. So in that time, so the projection base year was 2010, and then we projected until 2100 every 5 years, in a 5-year step. So it involved 3 steps. The first step was to converting the SSPs into fertility, mortality, migration, and education scenarios. So given the SSPs narratives, we defined what kind of fertility, mortality, or the components of demographic component of change scenarios. And we basically, for example, for fertility, we defined low, medium, and high. So 3 scenarios so once we define for each SSPs what kind of demographic scenario would be, the second question is about operationalizing the scenario. So what does medium fertility means? What does low fertility means? And what does high fertility means? Luckily, during that time, we were having an independent exercise involving many demographers from all over the world, thinking about the future. So what would be the future demography of the world? So it coincided with that exercise, and so we got this information. So for operationalizing, that exercise was very important. And questions like, how does low fertility, what does low fertility means in terms of TFR, or what does medium mortality mean in terms of life expectancy at birth? So this operationalization was done. And then the third step was then projecting it, using demographic models, which IIASA has been a place in the past where these models were being developed. So in 2013-14, the main highlights of that projection, or the things that we should know, is that we divided countries into 3 groups, mainly by fertility level at that time. High fertility countries with total fertility rate greater than 3 children per woman. Then we have rich OECD countries and low fertility countries, because we had that different kind of behaviors were observed in these groups of countries. And then we defined, like as I said earlier, 3 variants for each of the fertility, mortality, migration, and education, and then combine them for each SSPs. So for example, SSP2, we had the medium scenario of median fertility, mortality, migration scenario, and the global education trend, which is the medium education scenario. So this way we define SSP2, and other SSPs were the combination of different variants and sometimes a mix of variants. So we even had some cases where we had to, the fast track education scenario was too fast, and then we had to do something else. And this was an iterative process. So there were numerous meetings that took place in the community, and we had this iterative process resulted in defining exactly what I saw in this slide. So for each SSPs, here so in the rows, we have the 3 country groups, and for each country groups, we jointly decided what kind of fertility, mortality, migration, and education scenarios are there. So these are all, I mean, Wolfgang is here with us there, and we can discuss more on if there is some question on a particular set. But it was, as I said, it was an iterative process where the first set had a different view, like SSP2 medium, and then there could be discussion about while in case of fertility, just to give you an example, like SSP1 we started with all low scenarios, but then discussions resulted in the change that rich OECD countries fertility might not be low, but stay in medium. So these arguments are all documented in our paper that's published in 2014. So this was the past, and we continued collecting data, secondary data about what the things have been changing. And in 2018, like we say, like 5 years after the first SSPs, we updated in our own website. So it's not in the SSP database, but we have been updating the projections because UN updates the population age and sex projections every 2 years. And we did it in 5 years time. So our main idea was that for the long-term assumptions, we didn't want to change much because this was based on, as I said, a big exercise. And then what we did was like the first level of change, like changing the baseline data and how it changes, let's say, until 2030. And we also moved our initial data, baseline year to 2015. And then few more countries where we get more data were also added. And wherever we get new information on fertility, mortality, migration, education were updated. One thing that we proposed and did was that these 3 country groupings, we had the same assumption for all low fertility countries, because previously we distinguished by OECD and non-OECD, because we got a feedback that the distinction between OECD and other low fertility was, this was criticized as highly artificial and implausible. So we are in the process of abolishing it, or we have abolished it in our 2008 revision. So what we are doing now is we are now targeting the plan that Detlef showed. So the thing that will come in the next update would be that the baseline will be moved to 2020, and we depend on the age-sex distribution of the population. We depend on the UN, and there was supposed to be a update in 2021, but because of COVID, this postponed to 2022. So we will be updating the baseline, whatever we get from the UN, and then some other things that I put here is this: how low will the fertility decline? And we have now results from some countries like South Korea, where the fertility has declined to 0.84 children per woman, which is I think we didn't imagine it would go to that level. So there are some parameters that we have in the model that needs to be updated. So this is work in progress. So we are setting up our group. There are still people who have been working in that group earlier ones. So migration is also one of the important things that we will be revising. Yes, so basically at the moment we have started to form the groups and see what else we need to do on top of what we have already done in 2018, and if there is any suggestions, anything that is coming from the community, I think this is the perfect time for us to receive that. I really see the importance of these interactions in the community. That would be very useful for making our SSPs better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Samir. I would like to open the floor again for a Q&A session for slightly over 10 minutes now. Okay, I think I saw a hand raised, but I have to find out where to find. There are two even. Elaine Ben Viste.
Hello, Detlef. Thank you. Samir, I had kind of a technical question on the updating of the migration assumptions and the population projections. Is it you mentioning it's based on the new UN migration stocks, or maybe different assumptions about net migration? Is there going to be anything along the lines of updating the way you come up with the education and age profiles of migrants, or is it going to be based on the same standard assumptions that were used for the original projections? Sorry, this is a technical question. Thanks, Samir.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Yeah, we are looking into it. So Guy Abel, who is one of our migration expert, is also with us, and we will be discussing with him about the updates. So basically, at the moment, we are assuming based on the UN's stock data. Guy has estimated what were the flows. Yeah. And so we are using that flow as a flow. Total flows were being used in the 2018 version, but we already are working with the age-sex distribution of the flows. So definitely this the next SSPs we will see like how we will bring that in. For the education, it is still education-specific migration rates. They are still, it needs to be studied. I mean, many of us are working on it, not only here, but others as well. So this, the education-specific migration would be, I'm not sure whether we can have some concrete results for this round of SSPs. But for age and sex, we will have the one that would be defined by what Guy estimates from the UN stock data. There is a new update of that stock.
Okay, thanks. Nico Bauer.
Thank you very much. Hi, Detlef. Yeah, thank you very much, Samir, for providing this population data, which is very, very useful in various respects. And recently we were working on a paper and it came over us with full force that life expectancy in developed countries is now in a way that people born today will see 2100 and beyond. And that makes me ask you the question, have you guys ever thought about extending the time horizon? This is also a background from Earth system modelers. They come up with the question, more frequently and more intensively, I have the feeling, to go with our scenarios beyond 2100. And I mean, demographics is probably the backbone here again. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Nico. I missed a little first part of your because of my internet, but I had a request earlier. Somebody at IIASA, some visitor wanted the projection to 2500, and I did it. And currently, I have a projection. I have to do some projection until 2300. So it can be done, but for the SSPs as a community, it would be for the community to decide how far we go here. But it's possible to do the projections in a, like, let's say, a scientific way.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the very interesting questions. I think there's still a question as well now in the chat that you might want to consider from Yachin Wu. And maybe you want to speak out. Yachin Wu, do you want to ask your question? Otherwise, I can read it as well. So this question is specifically on the feedbacks. So should we not, if this is all about climate change research, should we not take the climate change into account in the drivers?
Yeah. So at the moment, yeah, in this process of the SSPs, producing SSPs, we are the first ones. So the population is at the beginning. So of course, feedbacks are very important, and we are at the moment we don't have that in the model. Well, through in some of the SSPs, we have some kind of feedback already, like in terms of scenarios, but the real feedback is not yet there. But I always offer our model or our data to colleagues that, if they want to bring the population model implicit in their model, it can be done. Yeah, like from the effect of air pollution on child mortality or adult mortality can be done. So you can have the SSP2 there, but then being impacted, having a feedback from some others model. But as a core SSPs, I think we don't have it there.
This is Wolfgang Lutz, if I can just add one word. I think this is a rather fundamental issue, because the SSPs, is that they are designed, they show the development of the socioeconomic world that then will meet different degrees of climate change. So climate change should not directly be factored into the possible effects of climate change on migration or on fertility and mortality. So this is something we really have to discuss at the forum, as sort of a more sort of the philosophy of the SSP approach, whether it's still meaningful to have, let's say, population scenarios that don't have any feedback from climate change onto mortality or migration.
Yes, so there is some considerations of this also in the O'Neill paper. So in the original design of the SSPs, we deliberately did not include climate impacts, partly because we wanted these scenarios to be used by the climate impact community. And if we would have climate impacts into the original drivers, you would start the question, how much consistency, and so how much was the impact in there, and should we take it out again? And so that was, to make that easier, we didn't take them into account. But at the same time, if we believe that climate change is going to be an important force into the future, at some point that idea becomes a bit illogical. So we were already discussing it also in the context of this update. And at that time, we were also thinking, is it maybe useful to provide two sets? Is it useful to provide a set where you don't include it and one where you have some impact, so that people can actually choose what is more appropriate for their particular exercise? But yeah, we now decided we can't do it, and we will not do it for this update, but as Wolfgang already indicated, it's a scenario forum that might be also not a topic that we want to discuss in more detail. The last question. Okay,
I see some questions here in the chat. Maybe I just go quickly through.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is from Samraz about whether we should be accommodating the loss in education due to COVID. That is, I think that would be our main kind of contribution for this time. So we hope that we get some information about not only on education, but also on fertility and mortality. So that would be the main update. I mean, having already done in 2018, right? So this will be our main thing. And then I have Brian's email, Brian's message about how much things have changed and whether we need to do that. I think our first SSPs were mostly based on the census of earlier than 2010 round, because by then the data from the new census round of 2010 were still not there for all the countries. So it's I think when we did 2018 round of update, we got lots of new data for lots of countries, and mainly the improvement in under 5 mortality really impacted a lot on many projections and our projections. And so the result was such that our projection, the updated projection, has a bit higher, will reach a bit higher peak. And then, yeah, for fertility, we had some surprises, some fast decline in fertility in some areas, like including I think China. Yeah, that's what I can add. Maybe Wolfgang, if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, and so if not, then in that case, I would like to close the session on demographics, and miraculously, we are exactly at the time that the agenda indicates that we would make this transition. We go to the economic part, and we have 2 speakers, Marian Leimbach from Potsdam Institute and Rob Dellink from the OECD, which were both also involved in creating the original scenario. So we had at the time actually 3 different elaborations of the storylines by economic modeling groups. We used mostly the OECD set, but there were also a PIC and IIASA elaboration. And so the floor is yours, Marian.
Yeah, thank you, Detlef. So let me share my screen. So I want to briefly present updated SSP GDP scenarios, which can be characterized as a level 1 update in the classification that Detlef introduced earlier. So it was mentioned that the current GDP scenarios are a bit outdated. I think that's right, but it's also a natural process. So projections will never completely match later observations, and it's nearly impossible to foresee events like the COVID pandemic. So that's one part of the update story. The other is, as we started to update the scenarios, we of course wanted to include the most recent data. And using most recent data means to use new databases, or at least new versions of existing databases. And this creates a bit of irritation, as is illustrated here. Here we see, or here we compare historical data of GDP, so not projections, but historical data of GDP of 2 versions of existing databases. So in the dot lines, you see the data from the more recent or most recent database. and in dotted lines, the data from the somewhat older versions of the databases, and the colors are then the different databases: Penn World Table, World Development Indicator, World Economic Outlook. And we clearly see the difference in the data of the two versions of a single or of the same database. So quite clearly you see it here for Sub-Saharan Africa, also for Latin America. But also the difference is significant also in China and India. In 2010, it's about 10 to 20%. So that's something that shifts our starting point, or then also makes a bit of complication for smoothing to the projections. In the construction of the updated scenarios, we followed 3 steps. So we start from updated historical figures for the time period 2010 to 2020. We selected the World Development Indicator as data source because it has a large country coverage and was also widely used in the community. Then for the short-term projections until 2025, which also covers the COVID effect, we use the IMF, the most recent IMF estimates. And for the long-term projections, we assumed a transition back to the original SSP pathways until 2100. By that, we maintain the underlying narrative, in particular with regard to the convergence of each country to the technology frontier. Or in other words, we assume that in 2100, the ratio between each country's GDP per capita to the GDP per capita of the US is the same in the new, in the updated scenarios as in the original scenarios. So here's the other results. Oops, that's the wrong direction. That's are the results. So for these 6 world regions or countries, we see here the updated projections. The solid lines are the new or the updates, and the dotted lines are the regional projections, and in the different colors are different SSPs. So we see in the initial years that, the new data are mostly above the original data or the original projections. And with respect to what I have tried to explain with respect to the deviation of the different versions of the databases. So the major reasons why they are diverge, and this is what you then also see here, are updates of the GDP accounting, different deflators, and also an update of the purchasing power parity conversion rates. So that's all what you then see in this difference here in the initial years. It's partly compensated or counteracted by the COVID effect. So you see the COVID effect quite nicely here in Europe or in the US. And these significant differences but can also be seen in the short-term and long-term projections. So for instance, for India, India starts at a higher level than the original projections today, and turn back to the long-term original projections from above. The opposite is true for Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, which starts from a much lower level than projected before in the original projections. These scenario data are available and can be accessed by these link to to a website of the Navigate project. And before I hand over to Rob, who then continues with the plans of the 2-level update, I want to point to another result, which goes into the direction of what was also discussed before. So to extend the set of drivers. So based on the updated GDP scenarios that I introduced before or described before, we also constructed so-called structural change scenarios, a kind of sectoral disaggregation of the GDP scenarios. These scenarios here are represented in terms of labor shares, value-added shares, and energy shares for the major sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And these scenarios are available for each SSPs until 2050. So I hand over to Rob.
Great. Rob, the floor is yours. You probably have to share a screen.
Thank you, Detlef. Yes, let me try to share my screen. I hope you can all see this.
Perfect.
Excellent. So, so Marian basically presented what can you do if you do a kind of a quick update of the economics projections. And what I want to talk about is more what our plans are for doing a proper update where you look at the different drivers and update all the drivers plus the long-term effects, etc. So the background is that, as we all know, the world has changed considerably, and there have been demographic developments. I think there's an updated view on trade as the driver of growth, whereas until 10 years ago, people still thought that trade would grow quicker than GDP, and therefore trade would be a major driver of economic growth. Whereas now, recently, we've seen that actually trade might be lagging behind other sources of GDP growth. And of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic as a major shock. So the objectives of this second tier update is to really revisit all the underlying key assumptions, use the improvements in the modeling tools that have been made in the recent years, and update all the drivers and not only the GDP projections. So basically going through a system again where we use the population projections, the education projections to then make GDP projections that look at the GDP and GDP per capita. And what is kind of new here is that we want to do this in a broader consultation with other economic teams. So on the updating of the SSP specific assumptions, we have the demographic drivers, we have the economic drivers like the speed of convergence or the catch up of less developed countries to the state-of-the-art countries. There's also an overall productivity growth or technological progress over time. There's trade openness to consider, and there's COVID-19, and I already said that. But as Detlef pointed out at the beginning of this seminar, there will be no change in the storyline. So this is purely improved insights and improved data, but not a new interpretation of the scenarios themselves. So we haven't done the analysis yet, but I thought it would be interesting to have a quick look at what is the latest official forecast from our economics department colleagues on GDP growth in the long run. And if you can see here, the blue line is what our economics department projected in 2012, which we kind of used as the basis to calibrate our SSP2. And in orange is their latest projection. And then in gray is the SSP2 projection as it's there. Now, this is only by decade, so you don't see a growth to 2019 and then a slump in 2020. It's just a straight line between 2010 and 2020, just for simplicity reasons. Obviously, in reality, it went up and then rapidly down, but we'll get to that in a moment. So you can see for the USA that in the long run, SSPs were less optimistic about growth in the USA than the economics department of the OECD was. And in the recent projection, the growth rate, the long-term growth rate, is actually slower than it was anticipated 10 years ago. The same story holds for China. The OECD in 2012 predicted quite substantial growth. SSP2 already had this feeling that that might have been a bit of an overestimation. And now when we're 10 years later or 9 years later, we see that basically everybody agrees that that revision has to be made and that economic growth in China is very likely to be slower than what was anticipated 10 years ago. Next up, Indonesia. Here's an interesting case where actually the SSPs felt that the OECD economics projections were maybe on the low side, that Indonesia would quickly catch up to, say, Chinese levels of growth. But actually, when you look at it now, the latest forecast by the economics department is again a lower growth. So this is the recurring theme, and Brazil shows this very clearly. The latest projections, the latest forecasts are substantially lower than the forecasts of 10 years ago. And that does mean that, that we will have revisions of all the SSPs based on historical data, but also in terms of long-term economic growth. And the final one, two countries that often people take like either together or think that they're very similar, Japan and Korea. As you can see, there were actually quite big differences in Japan and Korea in terms of how economic growth was in SSP2 versus what the official OECD forecast was at that time. And you can see that SSP2 was actually now is much closer to what the OECD is now forecasting in terms of growth. So yes, all these SSP projections are outdated, but on the other hand, sometimes they are not that far off from what we would forecast now. On the opposite side, Korea is a typical case where the latest projections is fairly low, but actually we were very optimistic on Korean growth 10 years ago. So that might be a larger variation that we have to make. And very briefly, and I know I'm running out of time, the impacts of COVID on economic growth. So what you see is when you have a big decline in the growth rate from +4 to -3% in the year 2020, you almost automatically get a rebound effect in 2021 just because the level of GDP is lower. So if you add the same amount of goods in 2021 as you would have done without a COVID pandemic, then you would actually have a higher growth rate. On top of that, we see in the US and in China, other regions not so much, but we see that there is an actual rebound effect, that growth has been faster than is anticipated before the COVID pandemic. But in the long run, we probably see that growth rates will go back to the original levels. But what does that mean for GDP levels? It means for GDP levels that you get this quick decline, and then you get actually a permanent effect that the level of GDP is lower also in the long run. So if we think about these updates, we do need to consider both the short-term and the long-term consequences, also short-term shocks. And I'll skip this slide, except to say that the differences of COVID, the effects of COVID on GDP impacts differ quite substantially across regions. And one of the things we'll have to grapple with is that it is still quite uncertain how we get out of this COVID crisis. It's still quite uncertain how economic activity will recover. We know a lot more than last year. Last year, we basically just said no. Whenever anybody asked us, can you update SSPs? Can you update long-term economic growth forecast? We just said no, because we had no idea. This year, we feel a little bit better about it. We feel that we could say something, but we'll have to stress that at least in the short run, there is a major uncertainty also at the regional level on the effects of COVID. So I'm running out of time, and I fully realize that, but I just wanted to say we are looking with a broader group of economics groups, including people from IMF, the GTAP, OECD, SEPI, PIC, IIASA, and we're looking at both making better projections in the longer run after this phase 2 updates, looking for more of a phase 3 or phase 4 update, where we're thinking of things like institutional and governance variables. Because if you look at economic shocks, actually the major driver of economic shocks is conflict. and the SSPs currently say nothing about conflict. And it will be very hard, but it might be interesting to look into that. And also, Marian already talked about that a little bit. We want to do more different types of projections, more indicators on within economy inequality, looking perhaps at welfare indicators, looking at structural change, downscaling of economic indicators to grid cells so they can be used with other types of models, and also looking in more detail at trade projections. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And still reasonably in time, or we have still 10 minutes left for a quick Q&A. So anyone that would like to start asking questions? Ryan.
Yeah, thanks. This is stimulated initially by Marian's presentation on the how to think about the long-term outcomes and consistency with the original SSPs. And so it's kind of a two-part question, like, is that important to do? And if it is, what would that mean? It seems like what you decided there was to converge to the levels of GDP per capita in the long term, based on the storylines. I would imagine, though, that the storylines probably have as much or more to do with growth rates than levels. And therefore, if you converge to growth rates, you might get levels that are pretty different. And in what Rob is talking about, I think you might end up with, quite different long-term outcomes. And then that just brings me back to, like, that's all fine, but that brings me back to the consistency issues with CMIP and so on, as this would require running through and saying, okay, what are the consequences for emissions? What does that imply for the consistency with the climate models? So I don't have a suggestion here. I'm just asking about it. Like, what do we do in this kind of situation?
Yes, great. Either Rob or Marian, do you want to start in responding?
Yes, I can start. So there's of course the alternative in long-term projections to either to base it on the levels or on the GDP growth rates. I think convergence to growth rates is a bit difficult, because the growth rates are changing permanently over time in these projections. You of course could assume that you take as a representation of the storyline the growth rates, not the levels. But if you use the growth rates and then combine it with these new starting points that you get from the new databases, then you end up with completely confusing projections where, for instance, Zambia has a higher GDP per capita in 2100 than the US. So that's certainly something you want to avoid. But yeah, I agree. So using these levels as a reference is not the only way you can do this. And in the end, it's our plan to completely revise this approach, as Rob has pointed out.
Rob, any response?
If I may, that's a good question, Brian. I think on the one hand, I fully agree with you that intuitively, I would also think that if you start in the COVID shocks, you have this shock, and then gradually growth rates recover to the old growth rates, but the levels are permanently different. So short term, these quick adjustments where you actually take, I've seen, I don't think Marian does that, but I've seen other approximations where they use the levels of the GDP levels in 2100 of the SSPs, and then say, well, everything that's in the short run basically just fades away over time, and we end up with exactly the same levels. I think that's a little bit, maybe a bit too short. But for me, in principle, there's two things we need to do. One is look at new data and then, without changing necessarily the modeling assumptions, you already get a difference in the levels but also in the growth rates across the different SSPs. And that, I think, is just normal, and that is in line with the same storylines, and that has an impact. But there's a different question on top of that, and that is, to what extent is our SSP2 what I would call a baseline scenario in line with official forecasts? It will never be the same. But in 10 years ago, we made this very clear distinction that we said, well, we think that the official forecasts are too optimistic, and therefore we basically scaled down SSP2, and in relation to that, also all the other SSPs. Now, this time, we may well end up with a community insight that the official forecasts are maybe a little bit too pessimistic. Maybe they overcompensated for their optimism of a few years ago. Maybe SSP2 is actually a little bit more optimistic than official forecasts. And if you have that assumption, then the SSP2 emission projections, and therefore in relation to that also the other SSPs, would be much closer to the original SSPs. So these are two fundamental things. How do the SSPs compare to each other? Do we need to make changes there? We have to use the same tools. Can we use that also for making SSP2? Probably not. Probably we need more detailed thinking about what that means in SSP2.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I think it's a reasonable discussion between the relative or the absolute level interpretation of the scenarios. And yes, so the update of the base year is a nice, necessary short-term fix, while in reality it's more important to also update also our vision of the future to what we know now, and therefore we want to go to this level 2 update. And then your question about the consistency with the CMIP data, Brian. So this might become especially an issue on the high side. On the low side, it's much less of a problem because the climate policy, we could assume that it reaches the same emission levels, the forcing levels again. It might especially be a problem for SSP 5, RCP 8.5, whether we would ever define something again that high. Maybe that's a nice side effect of this, because it would discourage the use of that particular scenario. Yeah, for instance, the 7.0 and 6.0 watts per square meter levels, yeah, we might want to search where new scenarios would end up in the longer term and whether there is a consistency issue or not. Yeah, in the short term, we are first updating population in GDP, so we will only also know once those things are then taken up into the IAM models. But I think, yeah, it might be worthwhile to think a little bit further about this consistency issue than my first response earlier. Nico.
Thank you. Yeah, the question goes in the same direction as to Samir before. How do you see the perspective on broadening and extending the time horizon with respect to the GDP scenarios? Would you be able and willing to do so, or do you say, oh, no, that's too far into the future? Thanks.
Yeah, and Rob, the first offer from the demographics team was 2,500. So
I'm actually already extremely nervous that we make projections to 2,100. Generally, we don't go beyond 2060. And anything after that requires broad uncertainty ranges normally. The SSP scenario, the economic projections in the SSP scenarios were made for climate change analysis. They're not economic forecasts to be seen as our view on how the economy might look like in 2100. I don't think that we have enough to say that if we had to do that, we would indeed include broad uncertainty bands that get wider and wider over time, and they start overlapping across the SSPs, and basically you end up by the year 2500 anywhere between 0 and infinity for all the 5 scenarios. They would all be identical. So I think 2100 is already a big stretch for the economic projections. There's a consistent framework. We did look very carefully when we made the original projections. We had to revise quite a number of assumptions in order to make the model not collapse after 2060. But we managed that, and I think we're happy with how we did that. But I don't think we can go beyond 2100.
Okay, thanks. I think we don't have burning questions, I think, nor in the chat, nor in the with hand raising. So also given where we are in time, I might want to give the floor to Bas van Ruijven to start and finalizing the session. I first of all would like to thank also all presenters for their presentations today. It's a process that we have now started, as announced. What we want to do now is also at the IMC meeting in December to show further elaboration of our plans. Then, as indicated, hopefully May next year, we have the first quantifications so that we can share them at the scenario forum next year. And that would be then the moment that we really would like to finalize those new data sets for both demographics and economics. And at that same forum, also allow for the more wider discussions. And I think there were very interesting remarks here on the future of the SSPs that might involve more radical changes. But at this point, the floor is yours, Bas.
Yeah, thank you, Detlef, and thanks to all speakers for a great webinar here. I think it was very informative for many persons, and it was very good discussions. It was very good to see this. I have a few final remarks. First of all, also that, yeah, there will be next webinar, so stay tuned. I see some discussion in the chat evolving around RSP 8.5. We are brewing on a webinar on realistic high-end scenarios and to have a discussion on that, but we are looking to find the right speakers for that and the volunteers to step forward. So stay tuned there. It might not be the next edition, but it's coming. And then I want to remind all of you here, you probably see the announcement of the Scenarios Forum being organized for June next year. We at the moment still have the call for session proposals open until mid-November. And so please, if you have any ideas for sessions in your field, your area that you would like to convene here, put in proposals. Go to scenariosforum.org and find the way to do that there. And yeah, then I want to thank again all of the speakers and also Jennifer McDonald here for helping us organize this session, and looking forward to seeing you all at the next webinar.